Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Building Trust, Breaking Blame, and Healing Shame, Conflict Coaching Conversations for Constructive Futures with Dr. Tricia Jones. I'm Melanie Reese, Director of Cadre, and I'm joined by our Cadre staff, Noella Bernal, Kelly Rauscher, and Amanda Reinhardt. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is being translated simultaneously into Spanish and into American Sign Language. To access the accessibility features, please follow the instructions on the slide. Next slide, please. A few technical notes. All lines have been muted for this webinar. Please post any questions that you might have for Dr. Jones in the question box, and we will share them during the presentation. And Dr. Jones has graciously offered to respond to the questions that we don't get to after the presentation so that we can disseminate them later. We ask that you do not post questions in the chat unless they are technology related. This will help us to monitor questions for the speaker. And we appreciate and want to thank you in advance for taking the time to respond to the brief survey at the end of the presentation. Your feedback is critical to Cadre's ability to continue to bring you webinars such as this one. And finally, we will be recording this webinar and we'll post and archive it on our website. Next slide, please. I am truly honored to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Tricia Jones, Professor of Communication and Social Influence and Director of the Center for Conflict Management and Media Impact at Temple University. I've heard it said that you should never meet your heroes, but that hasn't been true for me. I was a fangirl of Dr. Jones' work and research since I was in graduate school many, many moons ago. Her research in dispute resolution was consistently thought-provoking and challenged the field to think and rethink our understanding of dispute resolution. And it wasn't until many years later that I met one of my academic heroes, and I was not disappointed. I could take up so much of our time today listing out her many achievements and her accolades beyond academe, things like serving as a senior consultant working in dispute system design for the United Nations Ombuds and Mediation Services, and for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Ombuds and Mediation Service. She's co-chaired the Peace Education and Conflict Resolution Education Work Group of the United Nations Conference at the UN headquarters, and she's working with the UN and World Bank on designing continuing education initiatives in conflict coaching. As busy as she is, we are so fortunate to call her a Cadre senior consultant and are grateful for the opportunities that we've had to collaborate with her as often as we do. She is warm and generous in addition to being wicked smart. And it is my honor to welcome Dr. Tricia Jones.
Thank you, Melanie. It's really hard to follow that. Thank you so much. And it is such an honor to be here talking with you and being supported by Cadre in sharing ideas about ways that we can be helping to do conflict management and dispute resolution even more effectively for the families and for the organizations that we serve. So it's a thrill for me. And I would just second your comment about meeting your heroes, because that's not only the way that I feel personally about the Cadre staff, it's the way I feel about the Cadre organization. I think so many of us really know that Cadre is the place for excellence in leadership in this field. So thank you so much for having me. If you'd like to, go ahead and enter your name, folks who are joining us today. Enroll in special education dispute resolution and location in the appropriate place. Just so if you haven't already provided that information, we have that up that we can access and look at. Also wanted to mention again that we will be not only happy to respond to the questions that might come through that we don't get to in conversation today and send that document out, but that we will also be providing links to the short videos that we are going to be showing. So hopefully at the end of this experience, you'll have access to all these materials in the way that's most helpful for you to use them. What we're going to talk about today is, first of all, introducing the idea of conflict coaching as an ADR process. We'll talk a little bit about the fact that conflict coaching has now been around for more than 20 years as an ADR process, but it's still one that may not be as familiar to you as some of the others. And so, kind of giving an idea of what conflict coaching is. Most importantly, start that conversation about how might conflict coaching support your ADR work in special education. There are a number of possibilities for how this process can be used, but as with everything we do, the real question is it being useful to you in the way you need it to be useful to you? And then we're going to spend the majority of today's work thinking about conflict coaching conversations that you might be able to take away with you today, especially those conversations that have to do with people who are dealing with issues of trust, issues of blame, and issues of shame in their conflicts. As a conflict educator and mediator and ADR specialist for now a number of years, one of the things that is always an important recognition for me is that those challenges of trust and blame and shame are the most corrosive we often face in conflict. And having processes and conversations that help us help somebody else think through those challenges in their own conflict situation is a gift and often something that can make a difference in the kind of relationship that they can build, relationships that are so important. So, um, Melanie has graciously said enough about me, so I'm going to flip through that. And I want to just invite you to take a moment. And if you have a couple of communication and conflict challenges that really stand out for you in your special education dispute resolution work, what might those be, right? So just invite you, if you'd like, to enter a couple of those into chat. And as those come in, if Mel, if you want to kind of, you know, pull out some of the ones that seem to be coming through more than others, just to try to get a sense of what can we talk about that's most value added for you today, and make sure that I can tie in the topics we're planning to discuss with the challenges that you're currently facing on your day-to-day work.
Not seeing any right now. Folks are
Okay. All right.
actually, they all came in at once. So
All right.
interpersonal, professional conflict, intergenerational differences, folks feeling victimhood by one or both parties, mismatched expectations, people not listening. They listen so they can respond. Lack of trust. Several on trust, unresolved trauma, handling heightened emotions, misinformation causing misunderstandings, cultural differences, responding to student behaviors, lack of transparency, conflict baggage, and many more that you can see in the chat.
Right. Excellent. Thank you so much for entering those thoughts. And, you know, we can't speak to all of them, but I'd like to say that there are a couple that I think kind of, for me, kind of ring the bell of why, again, kind of trust, blame, and shame are important things to think about, and how we might have conversational tools to deal with those, right? One of those I want to mention in terms of the comment about trauma and high conflict situation. Blame and shame are the byproduct of trauma and lack of your sense of being able to be vulnerable. And we're going to talk more about that when we talk about the breaking blame and healing shame portions, drawing on some of the work of Brene Brown. I also love the comments about kind of different cultural perceptions and expectations, and different intergenerational culture expectations. One of the things that's we have a lot of experience with is that when people come from a particular background or an orientation, what trust looks like to them, what blame looks like to them, what shame means to them, is often rooted in that generational culture, that racial, ethnic, gender, national culture, whatever that, the abilities culture, whatever that might be. And so first step, again, reminding us that we can't assume that what they need to feel a trusting environment or a blame-free environment or a shame-free environment exists is what we assume that means. And that's why these conversations that can happen in a conflict coaching process can become so helpful and valuable because it's their perspective that's being shared and privileged, not others' perspectives that they are wrestling with while they may still be thinking through their own. So let's talk a little bit about what conflict coaching is as a process, as an ADR process. And as I get into this, I want to give kudos to the field that is working with conflict coaching. So many wonderful thinkers and wonderful practitioners, like Cindy Noble and Stephanie Hardy and Rita Callahan and my colleague Ross Brinkert doing a lot of great work in conflict coaching. So I will take the opportunity to kind of speak for the field, if you will, of conflict coaching rather than just from my particular point of view. Um, Conflict coaching is a one-on-one ADR process, and it's designed to be able to help a party in conflict to be able to think through what is going on for them, to have that kind of private, supported conversation with a third party neutral where they can talk through, talk out, sometimes here for the first time, what they're thinking about what really is going on here and why is that important or what is driving this conflict for them, sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in negative ways. Um, it's a one-on-one process that helps them think about what is my preferred direction forward? Where do I want to be? What do I want to be living in this relationship and in this situation? And again, that's a conversation that other ADR processes, as wonderful as they are, as a mediator for 43 years, believe me, I'm a fan of mediation and other ADR processes. But other processes that involve shared space and time with other parties in conflict may not afford a person a chance to really think through, wow, where do I really want to go with this and why?
Tricia, there's a
Yeah,
question about conflict coaching. Are
sure.
you asking to talk to one party before the mediation?
Yes, one of the ways that conflict coaching is used, and this would be with a conflict coach who is not also going to be the mediator. Right? So wanting to separate those processes so conflict coaching as a conversation doesn't in any way challenge the neutrality and impartiality of the mediator coming in. But conflict coaches are used very frequently to work with people who know they're going to go into another ADR process or going into an IEP meeting, for example, so that they can think for themselves about what's going on for them, what's important for them to understand about their own orientation and what they want and need to say, and to help them put together some simple skills for them to be able to interact and engage with that other party as effectively as they can. So, in fact, one of the most increased uses of conflict coaching now across all contexts is in using conflict coaching as a preparation for some other ADR process that that person is getting ready to go into. And one of the reasons that's so helpful is that the conflict coaching process has as a third goal helping people to kind of work a little bit on skills, develop some specific skills that they can take forward when they are talking with or negotiating with or responding to anyone else that is another party in the conflict that they are needing to work with, right? Because as we all know, if you don't need each other, if you're not interdependent, you're not going to end up being concerned about having those interactions, conversations, and other processes to try to work things through. So conflict coaching, this one-on-one process, again, is from a third party neutral, somebody who's trained in that conflict coaching process. And it engages in these three goals. And essentially, the process allows the party to be doing that thinking for themselves. But there's also a very heavy emphasis on perspective taking in this conversation. So in conflict coaching, you're not only helping them talk about how they think and how they feel and how they feel they're being seen, but there's as much emphasis on what do you think's going on for the other party or parties? How might they be experiencing this? What kind of insights might you have? And how might those insights change or help you in how you want to be moving forward with this? The assumptions behind the process, very similar to those of mediation, right? It is a party-centered process where the party makes the decisions about what they want to be talking about, thinking about, how they want to think about moving forward. It is voluntary, confidential, and transparent. Ideally, as we've just mentioned, it's a part of a larger system. And it follows a principle of real efficiency, as we'll talk in a little bit more in a minute. Conflict coaching as a process can vary anywhere from a couple of hours, maybe even less, from start to finish, to maybe 4 or 5 one-hour conversations if the person wants to kind of space it out that way. But we're not talking about a process that sometimes is understood in other coaching approaches that is ongoing, very repeated, long-term. This is an ADR process, and as such, we want to help people as well as we can, as efficiently as we can, because in most cases, especially in special education situations, people need to feel that conversation is of value to them now, and they don't necessarily have the time to be spending more time than they need working through that with somebody. Yeah. We've already kind of mentioned why conflict coaching, right? I will say that it is a process that works extremely well online as well as in person. So it affords a lot of flexibility and it affords a lot of privacy if you're doing it in an online capacity. A very brief history. Conflict coaching was developed again around 1995, 1996. And it really came about in mediation programs in workplaces and in communities when somebody didn't show up for mediation. And we needed a service to be able to offer people who were still wanting to think about what am I doing, in this conflict. And since then, it has grown to be worldwide as a dispute resolution process. Extremely common in government agencies. Almost all federal agencies have conflict coaching as a part of their ADR offerings. Again, private sector and international organizations use it a great deal. So we now are really looking at a situation where when ADR specialists set up systems and think about designing systems, conflict coaching is added to the assumed necessities of a system for most organizations, just like mediation or facilitation or arbitration, etc. Right? And so just to give you that flavor of if you haven't been familiar with conflict coaching, which is understandable, it hasn't been as much in the educational field as it has in some of the other areas of organizations and workplaces. That's kind of a little bit of a background that we're talking about something that is over a couple of decades in practice and with an accepted sense of its effectiveness and utility. All right. It is, of course, we think an important tool, but not the only important tool, right? And just want to continually, consistently emphasize that. Mel, do we have a question that is coming up that catches your eye in chat? I see some of them floating through, but just wanted to make sure this might be a good pause moment.
Yes, and I'd like to remind everyone to put their questions in the question and answer box for us because it helps us to separate. So, but yeah, there are a couple questions. One is, would it be possible or desirable to use some of these strategies as a facilitator mediator, not just for separate ADR processes?
Oh, I don't know who put that question in the box, but I just want to know your name so I can thank you personally, right?
That's going to be
Yes.
Kathleen Nearison.
Oh, thank you very, very much. Yes, perfect question. We call that in our work, we actually call that perfectly coachables, because conflict coaching is a process, but it's also a series of conversations. And you can take any of these conversations and put them into facilitation, mediation, right? Any other kind of dialogue processes they can be inserted into, definitely facilitation and mediation. And we work a lot with people who say, wow, I really like that trust related set of conversations. Or, yes, we need to take the blame down here. Can we use some of these conversations, let's say, maybe in a caucus in a mediation? Perfect. And in fact, the more that you think about how is this useful for you, you can take the whole process and find great utility in it. You can take parts of that process and have that as just standalone conversations. And you can take those parts of the process and you can put those into other processes that enhance. It's almost like adding salt to a stew, right? I mean, as we know as ADR practitioners, what we want is we don't want to be wedded to only one way of doing things. We want to have those tools where we can bring them together and put them where they're doing the most good. So if anything we talk about today in terms of the conversations on conflict coaching, really, you're like, I like that one, please feel free to use it, whether you're conflict coaching or not. Fit it into anything that you think has value for you and the people you're serving. That's really what the design mechanism is behind that. So thank you for that question. That's great.
There was another question I think you might be getting to, but when talking to parties beforehand, what are specific questions you would normally ask?
And I'm assuming you mean talking to them before mediation or before a conflict coaching process. I'm not quite clear on that.
Yeah, it wasn't clarified, so.
Yeah. Well, first of all, if I'm talking to somebody who's going into another process and we're in a conflict coaching conversation, some of the questions that a good coach might ask would be, what do you understand about this other process that you're about ready to take part in? What are your expectations? What is it that is exciting or, valuable to you about that expectation? What is it that you are concerned about? What could you know more about that process that would help you feel like you could get in there and be your very best self, right? You could present yourself exactly the way you'd like to, so that this process is going to get you closer to what you'd really like to have happen for you or for your child or for the person that you are supporting in this process. And in fact, one of the things that we do in conflict coaching, there's a lot of times that part of the conversation is completely about helping them prepare for going into an IEP meeting or readying for a mediation, or perhaps having a very difficult conversation with someone that they know they have to have before they go into one of these other processes. So, yeah. But where those questions come from is always first understanding where are they now in terms of what is going on for them and what's important. So a conflict coach, like a good mediator, comes in with an awareness of valuable questions, but not with a predisposed plan to ask those questions, because those questions are only as relevant as the extent to which they fit the story of the person that you're talking with, right? And so always a reminder to me, what they need to know and think through may not be what I think they need to know and think through. So the heart of it is helping them have their own conversation about what's going on. Noted that in the very recent January 2024 survey that Cadre did, in the question from LEA directors, what are some of the things that you'd like in terms of supporting you? There are a number of wonderful things that are listed on here, but one of the ones that was at least heavily of interest to people was coaching others through conflict. And again, your decision where and if this work fits for you and in what way. But I think that there's a lot of feedback in things like this survey that would suggest that these coaching tools might be of value, and certainly of value enough to understand the process and then take out what fits, where it fits, and why it fits. And that's really the goal. Fitting systems, we know integrating into systems, we're already talking about that and have really talked about that. And the whole spectrum, one argument that can be made is that, in all of these areas of the spectrum, there are places where conflict coaching may work and be of value, right? I think that really the, uphill, or excuse me, upstream kind of aspects of the conflict resolution process is probably where conflict coaching is going to get you the most value, not the only place, but the most value. Because that's where people can really get a better understanding of what is happening for their conflict and then take that forward to be clear on how they want to behave, where they want to go, and why. And from that comes those great relationships that can be built around trust and collaboration that can put this on a constructive path that doesn't have to have the kind of escalatory processes that we see all too often, right? So I've been doing this work since 1996, and I will say that while I appreciate its value in many stages, if I were, saying where do I think most people will get the most value, it is in those early access, early prevention places before you have really serious difficulties. Is it helpful when things really go sour? Sure it is. But again, that might be something to kind of keep in mind. And the last thing that we'll say in terms of this is just that, again, lots of ways it can fit with systems as a standalone process where people go through conflict coaching and not necessarily need anything else in terms of a process to work through their situations. Before facilitation or mediation, during facilitation or mediation, right? That's a little bit more complex, but something that has increasing utility in a lot of places. And after mediation and facilitation, one of the most valuable uses of conflict coaching that we're seeing, particularly in some environments, is after the mediation has happened or after the IAP meeting has happened, you know, helping people to still work with a conflict coach to think about, okay, now how am I going to live out or live through that conversation, that goal setting, that agreement that came out of that ADR process? Because, there's always the stumbles and catches, and the stumbles and catches can be kept small and less significant. And conflict coaching is a really good process to make available to people for that purpose. We've already kind of talked about this, so won't say too much more about that. It does speak to the earlier question about how might you kind of have conversations to help somebody get ready for another process, right? And this slide is really directed toward that, analyze kind of what's coming next, identify what they understand about that process, how they want to be able to present and engage in that process, and then to kind of have a sense of how will I know that I did what I wanted and needed to do, and then live through that agreement that comes out. Last but not least, a lot of times people will ask us, does it have to be an ADR specialist who is a conflict coach? I just want to say that in most cases it is, because they understand a lot about, the ADR spectrum and those processes. But we've worked in a number of situations where people will be trained as conflict coaches without having an ADR background. And in some cases that can be peers, pilot programs where parents are trained to do conflict coaching with other parents. Not about substantive desired outcomes for the special needs situation, but in terms of helping to think, how are we going to, or how do you want to build a relationship in this situation? So there's a lot of flexibility there as well. This is a conflict coaching process that we developed. It's not the only conflict coaching process. And again, to me, what's important is all of the coaching processes that I know of that are conflict coaching processes share those basic three goals, right? Ours, pretty much similar to almost all the others, but starting with, let's talk with the person about, what is conflict coaching? Let them know what that's about. So if they want to do it, they can say yes or no. If they want to go ahead, so what's happening for you, right? That kind of, let's discover what's going on for you and getting that kind of story coming out. And then we really emphasize kind of this issue of drivers of conflict coaching. What are the things that drive the conflict that keep it going, right? Or that are problematic in some sense? And those usually are about identity, how you're being seen, emotion, how you're feeling, power, what you think you can make happen or feel you can't make happen, and trust, right? Um, and then helping them to talk about the future. What future do you want? You know, it's such a simple question, but oftentimes we don't give it the space to really let people talk through and think through what is it they really want. It's pigeonholed in certain ways. This is a place where they can be talking through that. Yeah, Melanie.
Yeah, there are a couple questions that have come up. One just saying, I love the conflict coaching guide and the parties sound positive. Do you think this should be mandatory?
I don't think anything should be mandatory, because I think it should be available. I think it should be offered as an option. I think the offering of it as a possibility should probably be mandatory, but I don't think it should be mandatory that people have to go through this process. Because I think the power of a lot of the work that we all do is that we are giving voice and agency to people who generally feel they have not gotten the voice and agency they need. And I think that conflict coaching is a great opportunity, especially since it's them without other parties involved, to be able to give them real space to have voice to themselves and for themselves and consider agency with themselves and for themselves and the others they love and care for.
Thank you, Tricia. There's another question. Just a clarification. Is a conflict coach like an advocate? Or if not, what's the difference?
Great question. No, a conflict coach is a third-party neutral, not an advocate, as valuable and powerful as advocates can be. A conflict coach is there not to suggest, and sometimes using that term coach has that sense that, oh, I'm going to tell you how to do it, right? But in conflict coaching, we would actually years later change the language maybe to a conflict support person, right? A conflict coach is there to help ask questions. It's a questions-driven process. And to, through those questions, help the party that you're talking with get a better sense of their conflict, a better sense of what's pushing them, and a better sense of where they do want to go and why. But the conflict coach doesn't advocate for them all to anyone else and doesn't advocate any course of action to them, right? And that's one of the reasons why I think conflict coaching can exist and does exist very well with other advocacy-based processes in a conflict arena, right? Because the coach doesn't do the same work an advocate does. Both kinds of work are valuable, very valuable and important. They're different. They are different. Yeah.
And there was
Melanie.
just one more request to clarify the bottom of stage 3. That's the last question I have.
Yes, yes. When we talk about testing, we don't mean reality testing, which is kind of like, oh, you sure that would work? That's not what we're talking about. Testing here is, do all the pieces of how you're seeing the future fit together for you, right? Because sometimes people are talking about wanting things that get in their own way. So that's a stage where the coach can say, so this is the kind of stuff that you're interested in. This is the kind of relationship you'd like to be having with them. This is the kind of work that you'd like to see happening. If this were moving forward, right? Is there anything in what you've talked about, right? Let me tell that, story back to you in terms of what I'm hearing. Is there anything that you're talking about that you think would make any other part of the future you want difficult to achieve? That's what we mean by testing. So great, great questions. Thank you so much. Again, we've talked about this flexibility and the perfectly poachables. All right. We're not going to do the Menti in the interest of time. Although I will leave that Menti link. And actually, if anybody wants to go on to the Menti link and fill it out, I'll check in, later on, and we can print out that Menti result and put it back, give it back to you in Cadre, and you can attach it if materials are interested. You don't need me to go to the Menti and fill it out, but we'll not take our time today to do that. Okay. And I think we've already talked about this set of questions that all of us face in thinking about does conflict coaching work, and how does it work best for us? All right. So let's shift gears to, okay, what are some of the kinds of conversations that we can have in conflict coaching that might be of real value to people in special education conflicts, and also that we might use as really great perfectly poachables to pull into mediation or an IEP meeting or some other conversational process, right? And thank you for putting that Menti link in, Noelle. I appreciate that. That Menti should be open and waiting for people, if they want to answer that. So let's start with talking about building and repairing trust. I think that, as many of you noted in your comments in chat earlier, trust is a huge issue in this work, and that in many cases, people have been engaged in and with systems that have convinced them that they can't trust and that they distrust and don't trust. So, these conversations are often necessary and helpful. And when we think about the special education context, we know that trust problems are probably greater in special education contexts than they are in a number of other kinds of situations. We won't go through in a lot of detail. What I did was put through just a kind of a summary of some of the more recent research that's been done on trust in special education contexts. And given who you are and the work that you do, you know this probably already. But bottom line is, not only do families and parents, and particularly of underrepresented groups, not trust the systems that they are working with in special education, but most of the special educators don't trust the systems that they're working in, and feel like it's really difficult for them to see a system that they can have faith in. And so if you look at across the whole range of the system that people are engaged in, right? Finding people who feel trusting or moderately trusting of what they're experiencing and where they're going and where they're being taken with this system, that is the exception, not the rule, right? So having ways to at least introduce conversations about trust can be helpful for a lot of people in a lot of places, right? One of the things that also is happening, and not to go too much into this, but it is a reality that is affecting where we live and what we do, is trust in general is harder for people to see or find in a lot of places, not just in the context that we work in. So it's kind of a layered issue with where is the trust, right? And the pandemic, as we all know, not only didn't help, it made things extremely difficult, but that lingers and lingers and lingers on so many levels, all right? And when people look at what's happening when they can't trust, they're actually primed to see more reasons not to trust. And that often translates into an increased fear and anxiety of what is going on, right? How do I work my way through? So all of those things kind of building on top of one another. I like Whitmer's short article talking about myths of trust, just to remind us that, she talks about the fact that, you can't repair trust as a myth. Well, you can repair trust, and we know how you can repair trust. It's just tough to do, right? And having trust, meaning, okay, we're in the clear. right? Don't need to be looking out for any other problems. No, right? Trust is an ongoing relationship that has to be established. And conflict coaching conversations about trust can be one of those things that kind of teaches a person to fish, if you will, in terms of thinking about how they build trust on a more regular basis. Certainly not the only way. So let's talk about some of the conflict coaching processes that focus specifically on trust. And then we're going to just pull out, 3 or 4 different kinds of mini conversations that we have as coaches about this. Again, here's that conflict coaching model, but in this case, let's say you're coaching and talking with somebody where trust is the core issue, right? You can see how issues of trust are kind of laced through all of the stages of conflict coaching that we mentioned earlier. In my mind, I like to kind of think as a practitioner as well as a theorist, what are the really core conversations? If you had to like bring it down to, if we can talk about this, and if we can talk about this, and if we can talk about this, those conversations are going to help almost always. Here are the core conversations about trust that as a conflict coach we can have. And if you want to poach some of these and take them into another process that you can have as well, right? Also, not pretending we're the only people talking about trust, not at all. We're pulling from great thinking about trust and trust relationships from a lot of different people. But here are my 3. What are your trust issues? Okay. I know that sounds like maybe a simple conversation, but a lot of times people have a very, very strong sense of mistrust or distrust or lack of trust, but they haven't necessarily had a chance to sit back and say, why am I not feeling I can trust them? And what are the kinds of things missing exactly so that I can get a handle on what would need to change to be able to have more trust, right? As opposed to this more global sense of, it's not feeling good, right? And I'm not going to make myself vulnerable to them at this point. So helping people unpack those trust issues. Right? How about how those trust issues are affecting the conflict that you're in, right? And when are they showing up and how are they showing up? Okay. Another way to think about that is, because of this trust issue, what are you doing or what are you not doing that is making this conflict better or worse? And last but not least, hey, how well are you talking about trust with these other people in this situation? You can't negotiate trust without talking about trust. And most people don't have easy trust vocabularies. Most of us haven't been given or maybe taught ways to actually bring up and raise issues of trust that don't seem to be dangerous or off-putting. Right? So if you left everything else behind, right, to me, these are the 3 conversations that I think make the most difference. We'll break them down in a little more detail for you, but this is the slide I'd put in my pocket and say, okie dokie. If I go into these 3, it's probably going to be some help, some kind of help for the person that we're, talking with or talking for. One of the activities that we can do with people, and again, conflict coaching has a lot of short conversations, has worksheets, has some activities you can do. This is a very simple one. And it's just giving somebody this 3 circles, and basically saying, in this situation, who do you really trust? Who do you kind of trust? And who do you not really trust? And who do you distrust, right? And give them a chance to just jot, right? Kind of where are they, right? And that kind of gets them grounded into thinking in terms of what their circle of trust is like, literally. Right? And then we want to go another step further. And I have found Raina and Raina's work very, very, very helpful. They are organizational development specialists who have been working in areas of trust for about 20 years or maybe even more. One thing I like about them is that they help people identify particular areas of trust that, instead of trust in general, particular areas of trust that they can unpack and figure out what's the rub, what really needs to be changed, right? So their idea is, trust really tends to fall about three things. One of them they call contractual. Not crazy about the language, but what they really mean is, hey, is this other person are they doing what you expect them to do? Are they fulfilling their role or doing the task or doing the support that you expect them to do, right? Can you trust them to do what they're supposed to do? Communication, huge. And what they mean and have identified in terms of trust-related communication problems is, is communication open and honest, timely, informative, and reciprocal? Bottom line, how do you need this other person to communicate with you? I might not need the same things you need in order to feel trusting of their communication, but I need to get clearer for myself on what do I need them to be communicating? How do I need them to be communicating with me for me to feel I can trust them? And third, competence. Hey, frankly, do they have the skills and knowledge and attitudes to do what needs to get done? They may be a great person, but I might not trust that they know what they're doing, right? So taking those three from Raina and Raina, and then, that idea from Roy Lewicki and some of his colleagues is also this notion of identification-based trust. I trust you because I think you're like me. I trust you because I think you're like me. I identify with you in whatever ways. So these ways or types of trust can help people unpack not only who do they trust or not, but why do they trust them or not? So you can ask somebody, okay, you've got the names down in these different circles. How about for people that you really want to concentrate on? Could be those you distrust and those you do, right? But let's concentrate on the people you want to concentrate on and tell me which of those, 4 things make you feel that you can trust them. Do you trust that they do what's expected? Do they trust that they communicate well with you? Do you trust that they're competent and know what they're doing? Do you trust that they understand you because they're like you in some way? So this turns into just a wonderfully easy conversation that takes them from 30,000 feet and takes them into a situation where they can really start thinking about what's there that I want to keep, what's missing that I need to have changed. Yes, Mel.
A couple of questions. One was just a clarification. Is contractual, does that mean accountability?
Accountability in the sense of, do they feel or are they accountable for doing what their role or what their expected support or performance is? Yeah. But it's not accountability necessarily in terms of an external accountability force. That can come up, right? I mean, in fact, some people have said that the real difference between trust and distrust is in trust, I don't know if I can be vulnerable to you. In distrust, I know I cannot be vulnerable to you. So if I distrust you strongly, then for us to move forward, I'm going to need somebody with guardrails who can hold you accountable for what's going on. Yeah, so that's where that plugs in.
Right. And then the next question or last question is, what if they have no confidence in the process?
I think this is a conversation, and again, this isn't Pollyanna, right? We're not kind of going, let's sit down and pretend life is rosy. It's right. That's why even bother having that conversation. But this conversation is about, can we talk about exactly what you don't trust in the process? So can we take it into what is missing and what would be there if the process were trustworthy for you. And a lot of times people haven't had a chance to be having that kind of conversation without an audience of other parties of the conflict. So this can be really helpful. We also talk about that as kind of a trust vision conversation, which we'll mention in just a minute, another kind of short conversation that you can bring in. So this little, circular trust exercise and activity is helpful. It's quick, something they can take with them. They can do it on their own. It almost always gets them closer to what's really needing to change here and why, than keeping a conversation at a more general level of, do you think there's good trust here or not? Right? And that's helpful. That's helpful. This kind of simple conversation, generally kind of another way of having questions that ask what comes out of the concentric circle activity. So if you don't want to use that worksheet, you get the same thing out of asking it through these kinds of questions, right? You may want to think about, hey, is it valuable to talk a little bit more about what's the history in this relationship, right? We think about that in terms of turning points in the relationship. I know, and some of you who know me know that I have had a parent's experience with special education dispute resolution systems in the past, and that in thinking about where was trust built and where was trust lost over time in that relationship, it's helpful to give people a way of looking at it. Not everybody is going to want to see this or to find value in this, but a lot of people, they kind of want to be able to have a sense of where did we turn the wrong direction, right? And what was going on there? And also, when was it good, right? So we have in your materials today a little trust turning points worksheet, very simple, that you can use to guide your coaching conversations or other conversations, right? Where have those turning points been? Let's put the high points on this little graph of your relationship. Let's put the low points on, and then let's kind of talk about them, right? What was going on with that high point? What was going on with the low points, right? The low point, you've got one low point, and that's kind of more important to you than kind of all the other high points. How are you seeing that? It's like, for those of us who have been or were earlier in our lives engaged in different kinds of mediation or conflict coaching related to family processes, to co-parenting, and etc., history matters. And how we remember history matters. And re-remembering history can bring up things that help us figure out how we want to write a different future. The same applies for trust. And this is frankly my favorite of the conversations about trust. What is your trust vision? So much of our conversation and so much of our focus is what is not working and what proves to me I cannot trust. And relatively little of our conversation is about, I know what I want to be living in terms of a trusting relationship with this school, this district, this educator, this family member, whoever that might be. Right? And so this is a simple trust vision conversation that you can use, right? Ideally, and don't be afraid of ideally, right? You're not saying you're promising ideal is going to happen, but thinking about ideal is empowering, right? Ideally, what will be the trust relationship if you can move forward as desired? Right? What will remain the same, right? What are the good parts of trust now that you can pull forward that you want to make sure you keep doing? What will be different, right? What, when, where, and how of trust behaviors, right? They would be doing this differently. They would be doing this to act more competent, to be more in role, to be communicating more trust in a more trustworthy manner, right? And you can really help somebody really unpack, wow, do you know that is exactly what I think I would like to be having and if it were happening, I would feel it was very a very trustful situation. What accountability or protections will be in place? Goes back to that distrust issue. So, yeah, what else could be there that would make sure the guardrails were up and on and everybody was being held accountable for this desired behavior? And then what will help make that reality? And that includes what they can do differently or keep doing the way they want to keep doing it, or what does someone else or some other system need to be doing differently? Again, doesn't mean that having the vision and articulating the vision is going to make the vision happen. But what it does mean is that without articulating the vision, you have a much lower chance of making the vision happen. And in this conversation, people can often see a path forward that they may not have seen as clearly without this kind of a trust-focused conversation. So you can also talk with people about how they can negotiate for trust, right? Yeah. In other words, hey, I have all these wonderful things that I'd love to have happen, but you know what? Some of them are deal breakers and some of them aren't, right? So which ones are the deal breakers? If I can only have these two changes in behavior, and that really is necessary for me to move forward with working with this person collaboratively, hey, let's concentrate on those two. Yeah, Melanie.
Yeah, should the school system indicate a trust person to the parents to help the conflict?
I think that'd be a great idea. I think it's a great idea. And, personally, I think that, and again, this is my bias because, um, you know, absence of trust is so much a function of presence of fear, you know. And I don't know, being a parent in that experience and working with a lot of people over a lot of years, I think that you have to be able to have these conversations at some point and not make people feel guilty about talking about the fact that they don't feel it's trusting, right? And that there's a lot of fear there. So it might be somebody trained. This is one of the reasons why the idea of, I think, peer conflict coaches is kind of a nice idea. Doesn't work for every system, but parents trained as conflict coaches to talk about, have trust conversations with parents who have just had their children recently identified as having special needs issues or concerns, something like that. I think it works really nicely. And I also think that it's very helpful with these conversations to be, again, coming from some neutral third party or somebody who is not in an advocacy role or in a decision-making role within the system, so that the person you're working with can really unpack and really feel free to talk about this is for them and about them, right? And there's no right and wrong. It's what they are living and what they'd like to live, right? That's the difference. And they need a conversation with a neutral to be able to do that. I think those neutrals should be available in every school. That's my bias, but I also understand that is a bias. Yeah, Mel. Yeah, Melanie.
Didn't have my audio off. So should school systems have an ombuds program?
That's an interesting notion because ombuds function in a number of different ways. I think you can have one, and I think that they would work well, but they would not necessarily look the same for every system. So I'm, going to tailor my response in that way. Ombuds, I tell you, one of the ombuds functions is not only helping people to navigate systems that they're in, but it's also to inform the system of what is and is not working. And I think that having an ombuds function, not necessarily as the sole presence, but as a presence, would be valuable because that ombuds office or that ombuds person could go forward and say, across a number of cases or conversations, I'm hearing a couple of things that are trust killers in this school, in this district, trust killers. And so I can send that up the ladder. And I think that conflict coaches do not fulfill that role. And so it would be a good combination of having, conflict coaches and facilitators and mediators and ombuds people working in that kind of very sophisticated way of who hears what and with what impact and is reporting out to whom and in what process. Yeah. Um, if you help people kind of negotiate, for trust, again, the deal breakers question is one of the big ones. Then you also can help people think about, okay, if you damaged trust with them, how can you repair it? And conflict coaching is as much about helping the party you're working with engage in their own self-change as it is thinking about somebody else's necessary change. So a lot of times in trust, this is an opportunity to help them think about, hey, what are the ways that maybe you didn't come through or didn't fulfill, you didn't communicate, you didn't, fulfill your role, you didn't provide a competency that you needed to, and what can you do about it, right? Literally, what can you do about it? So I like Shannon Warren's, work, always, always, always good. And these are those strategies that, are consistently helpful and things that people can concentrate on. How do I acknowledge or admit it? Do I want to apologize? And if so, how? Is there, something that, I want to ask for forgiveness or, ask them if they're okay with moving forward, right, in this situation? And what am I going to do differently? Let's take it down to the brass tacks. What am I going to do differently here so that I don't redo the same thing it's going to destroy trust again, right? So across all of these mini conversations of trust, any of which you can pull out and put into a lot of other processes. If one of these catches your eye, wow, run, run with it, right? But you can also see how they build together. And in this process, building together allows people to be able to have this continual insight about the trust dynamics and the things that they can make happen, want to make happen, need to have happen, right? Which then streams out in so many other ways in terms of, change behaviors, change systems, requests of systems, accountability structures, etc. So, pardon me for the bad pun, but I trust we've said enough to encourage you to be thinking about whether these trust conversations have been things that you want to try on. All right. Ready to take another bit of a turn, right? So one of the kinds of conversations and challenges in conflict is the blaming. And again, in a lot of the conflicts that we have, and almost all escalated, intractable, destructive, we all know this, right? Blame, 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 blame. And so are there some conversational tools? And again, we're not pretending that, we're waving our hand, having one conversation with them and then the world of blame disappears. But are there some conversations that we can use that we know usually have value to break the blame, at least to some extent? So here are some of the ones that we've found in our practice. Okay? Before we get to the conversations, a little bit of a teaser there, right? Blame and shame, literally hard to divorce the two because they cycle back and forth so often. So we're going to be talking now for the next 15 minutes or so about some, breaking blame conversations. And then we're going to wrap up our day with some healing shame conversations. But just want to mark at the outset that anytime you break blame, you heal shame, and vice versa. Right? So you're going to get two for the price of one if the conversation is of value to them. All right. We also know we live in systems where it's a circular firing squad of blame activity, right? And literally it's just like, wow, a lot of blame happening. And a reminder that conflict coaching is often as valuable for people who are in teams who are trying to serve families dealing with special needs issues where the team conflict is getting in the way of the work happening well, or teams of experts embedded in systems that have the blame arrows going every which way, right? So these things are applicable for those workplace conflicts and people who burned out, frankly, from the dynamic they're trying to help with. Okay? Also know that blame is a fundamentally disempowering process, right? When you blame somebody else, it feels, hey, I've been there. I blame people in my life. Yes, yes, yes. But what's happening there is that the blame itself communicates that what happens here is really up to them, not up to us, not up to me. And so being caught in that blame cycle, although it might feel good and tweak the emotional needs, it reinforces this inner speech, this inner awareness that I can't control this. So again, any kind of movement of that blame is going to be valuable in that sense for folks. And as we said earlier, trauma, right? When people are traumatized, and I happen to work in a world and work in a school district where, all best guesses, over 90% of our children and 90% of their families, would be identified as, moderately to highly traumatized on a number of different factors and dimensions. I think a lot of us in the room are in the same place. But we know that that trauma is always creating and leaving behind shame, blame, fear, and guilt, right? So I think that what we know as trauma-informed practitioners, which is that you don't ask the question, what's wrong with you? You ask the question, what happened to you? What's been happening to you? That applies here too. You can't blame the blamer, and you can't shame the shamer, because most of the time, that's not who they are. It's what's happened to them. And that's where that's coming from. And I say that as one of the imperfect humans in the world who has in the past blamed the blamer and shamed the shamer. Not always something that you can be ever present about the pain that's coming for somebody else. All right. I love Brene Brown. It's one of my dreams to meet Brene Brown one of these days. I will go down to UT and stalk Brene Brown. I apologize. I shouldn't have said that on a public webinar. But I really like so much of the work she does, and she concentrates a lot of her work on blame and shame, right? So I want to just share with you this short 3-minute video to kind of help us think about blame. And then we'll talk about, a couple of different kinds of conversations that might be helpful to break blame. Right? And I just didn't press the right button. Here we go.
How many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? Hi, my name is Brene. I'm a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple of years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house. I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And the first, a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: damn you, Steve. My husband. Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends. And the night before, he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep until you're home. And he got back like at 10:30. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed. Therefore, and so the rest of the story is I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, what's going on, babe? What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled all. do like dial tone. If you know, how many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, this is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the no, 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 no thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. But here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, hey, my feelings were really hurt about this, and talking, not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger. People who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we expend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships. And it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing the story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was.
All right. Thank you so much. Mel, question.
There's a question about blame. It's easy to blame those above us administratively. What's your recommendation for people in positions who are unable to make changes due to rules or policies set forth that are negatively impacting students, staff, and families?
I think the more we can be transparent about what the problems are in the system and depersonalize, I think the most important word in breaking blame is depersonalize, as we're going to show and talk about in just a little while, right? If the system is broken, and a lot of them are, magnificently broken in those ways, then one of the things that we can be doing is take it away from this person is bad, evil, or ugly, and creating this havoc. And this system is a system that needs to be diagnosed and altered, right? And then hopefully that gives us some of that momentum. Even if it does not give us momentum, I think it helps us appreciate the kind of compassion fatigue often that people are living through when they are that cog in that wheel, in that part of the system that is the most broken, and still trying to do their best with it, right? So yeah, I think that's a really, I think it's a valuable and a helpful conversation. Yeah. So the blame-related behaviors, and many of you know these, and again, we're going to kind of move forward from this and not spend that much time on it. Just want to give a nod and a shout out to the work that John Gottman has done over the decades in helping people recognize the kind of language and behavior that we use that really comes across as very blaming and demeaning and disrespectful, right? So one of the things that we can do in conflict coaching is we can talk to people about, what kinds of criticism do they hear or do they make? What kinds of contempt or, hey, I'm better than you. I'd never think that way, right? What kind of contempt kind of things come up in your conversations, And again, this is a private space, just that person and the coach. So they can share or not share what they want to, nobody's blaming or shaming them, you can't change what you can't see and talk about. And so this is really helpful. And Gottman is amazing in terms of he and his institute and his colleagues and the work that they have done and the work that they continue to do. Strongly recommend anything and everything you can do to connect with their work. And again, won't ask you about the 4 horsemen that you see in your work. I'm also going to move beyond. We have a short video clip that is in kind of a special education example. You'll have that video that you can access if you want to kind of watch it. The way that we were going to do this, but in the interest of time, I'm kind of moving forward a little bit, is to show you a couple of minutes of kind of a coach working with a mother in a special needs situation. asking for you to identify kind of what kind of blame behaviors do you hear the mother sharing about the person she's in conflict with, and then thinking about these blame breaking conversations and how those might work for her. But you'll have the video. If you want to look back on that, you can. Just want to mention that when we made these videos, not Oscar quality, but simple little learning and training videos, the friend and colleague who was doing the coaching activity exercise was Cheryl Catrona, who has been a long-term executive director of the Good Shepherd Mediation Program in Philadelphia, and very involved with PAODR and the hearing officer work. So just a shout out to Cheryl Catrona, and appreciate the ability. If you look at this, you're going to see not only hopefully some examples of how to help talk about blame and shame, but also Cheryl doing some really great coaching. All right. So what are some conversations that help us break the blame monster? Right? Again, it's all about depersonalizing. It's all about depersonalizing. Okay. And so we're going to introduce you to 3 conversations that you could try out. Okay. Again, some of these are going to take hold, and the person will kind of be able to shift away, at least somewhat, from this is the person who's the evil problem, right? To larger ways of thinking about it, right? In concert together, they kind of might work at, like, a good back rub, getting at all the knots that are going on there, whereas one hand by yourself might not quite do it. One combo might not do it. And sometimes the conversations don't land at the moment, but they land later. I've seen that happen often, when somebody will come back and go, I was thinking about what came up last time we were talking about this. And I kind of have a different way of seeing it. One of these breaking blame conversations is, hey, shift from the person to the context. What's going on in the situation, not the person. All of the psychologists in the room know about that fundamental attribution error, right? When things go well, it's because I'm brilliant. And when things go badly, it's because the situation's terrible. And when somebody else messes up, it's because they're bad. And when somebody else succeeds, it's because they were lucky, right? This is a conversation that just basically takes that idea and puts it into play. How's the situation maybe causing their behavior? Right? What else might be going on in the situation that could contribute to this behavior that you don't like? Have there been changes lately in the system or the family or the situation, right? What else has changed here in this context? Is that behavior that they're doing that you don't like, that you're blaming them for, is this similar to the past, right? And one of my very favorite questions, are there things that are just beyond their control? Are there things that are just beyond their control? And so often, when we help people just kind of lift the head, I mean, so we telescope down so much, and we just blame, 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 blame. When we lift the head and we look around and we think, what are the other 1,000 possible factors that are going on here that actually might be adding at least something to this untenable situation, right? It's not just them, might be partly them, but it's not just them. These kinds of things help people let go of the need to have the demon and to name the demon, and really get them to be thinking about, again, more powerfully, what does need to change. One of the ways to do that shift to the changes that have happened is really concentrate on the role that person is being asked to play, right? I mean, we all live in systems where the role one day is not what's expected from the role now, right? The role changes, the parameters change, the expectations change, and people are caught in that, right? So this conversation just asks them to, hey, what do you think are the, expectations for what this teacher is supposed to be doing, or what this special educator is supposed to be doing, or, what's going on with that, right? If they've changed recently, like how has that change happened? What is that change? And how do you think they might be feeling about those changes, right? They might feel like they are not in favor of these changes. The role is becoming who they don't want to be, right? The role is becoming who they would prefer not, to be in interactions and with the kind of influence they have. So again, taking it from the broader situation to taking it to that person's specific role, not the person, the role, and then taking that to how is that person maybe being hurt by these changes in the role they're being asked to fulfill, right? Builds a little bit of an opening for that empathy. And again, these conversations these are simple. These are not, 13,000 questions on a sheet of paper. They're intended to be simple because the simple can have the best benefit for somebody thinking through what's going on for them with this. And one of the last ways that you can ask them to kind of break the blame is just to like, hey, you might not like this, right? But is this person doing the same kinds of things to other people, right? Or is this just targeted behavior, right? Now, if they're doing the same thing to everybody, that doesn't necessarily make it right or good, but it does at least reduce some level of the pain of being the recipient of that behavior, and hence some of the need for the blame. And then that lets you ask, well, what do you think or what do you know about how they are being held accountable or even rewarded for certain kinds of behavior in this situation, right? Again, that shift into the system. So if we look back at these three conversations, right, again, each one 3 or 4 questions, right? Each one simple, all of them depersonalizing, and all of them having the opportunity for people to increase a little bit of empathy about what's happening for the other person as well as what's happening for you in this situation. All right. So there are other ways to deal with blame. We're not going to pretend today that, hey, these are the only conversations that might be blame breaking conversations. There's a lot of others, right? And there's a lot of great work out there. But if you've got a 25-minute conversation with somebody before they're getting ready to go into an IEP meeting the next day, and you're thinking, oh my heaven's sakes, what am I going to try to help kind of cut through this wall of blame and have just a slightly different kind of conversation, and the person thinking about some other things as they get ready to go in to that room with that party and other parties, then these are usually helpful. And the last thing that we're going to talk about, it's kind of a shame to say, well, we're going to spend our last 6 or 7 minutes talking about healing shame, because again, it's a hugely important area of work, but we're going to do it, right? And because it's useful. Not going to play the Brene Brown video. I will paraphrase it for you. Brene Brown, in her most recent work that's really focused on shame, really reinforces that when we are, ashamed, we are not being who we want to be, right? Shame is not the same as guilt, right? I mean, shame is I'm not living up to Trisha, and guilt is I'm not living up to what somebody else expects of me. But shame is corrosive, and shame keeps us from being vulnerable, and so we shield up, right? She has this great idea of shame shields. And these ideas that when people feel shame, they use one or more of these, right? So we either move away, move toward, or move against. And she describes those shields as this. And as I say these, I want you to think, if you will, about the shields that you see people raising, the shame shields that they use, and how those shame shields create a difficulty for them to be vulnerable and to work with others at the time they most need, perhaps, to be working with others, right? I'm not blaming them for that. That's just kind of the dynamic of shame. And one of the ways that that moving away shield happens is that the more people feel insufficient and ashamed of themselves, the more they try to disappear in their own lives. You know, they can disappear by literally ghosting people, hiding away, not showing up for meetings, you know, not sharing things that they'd like to really talk about. They can move away by psychologically and or physically, you know, taking, you know, substances, whatever it might be. So many ways to move away. Um, but that moving away makes it harder and harder for them to come back. And that's one of the things that she says a lot about shame, which is once shame is a part of who you see yourself as, the shamed, the shaming, then that moving away is more often done, more quickly done, more extremely done. Okay. Others can move toward people pleasing, right? I don't like who I am, so I'm going to try to make you like me, and I will do what I have to do to make that happen. And that people-pleasing behavior can be sacrificing a lot of different things that shouldn't be sacrificed. And then the moving against. You make me feel, or I feel worse than, less than I need to be, than I want to be. So I'm going to do whatever I can to make you feel less than what you want to be. I'm going to move against you. I'm going to make you feel shame the same way I'm making, you know, myself feel shame. And these three shame shields, right, are operative. A really valuable kind of conversation that you can have is, you know, what shields do people maybe think they're raising and why? And what is that doing for or not for them? Okay. This is a conversation that we often have when we do youth-based conflict coaching with young people. And I will tell you that it's a conversation, it's a topic, it's a way of thinking about shame that they have really gravitated toward. And it's been very interesting to see that work. It's something that helps to talk about why they're not feeling good about themselves in a way that seems to help be a little bit more vulnerable. I think it's a great metaphor that she's come up with. And I know in practice, it's often a helpful metaphor to help people talk about kind of how do they see themselves not being the way they'd like to be. Again, hey, if you get this video link, you'll get to see a little bit of this at the end of that video link. And so we're going to wrap up in our last 3 or 4 minutes and just say, we have some pretty simple but helpful conversations about helping people heal the shame. And again, we're not waving magic wands. We're not pretending that this de-traumatizes people who have lived through a great deal. We're not even pretending that at the moment they're going to feel something for that difference. What we know is these conversations can be and tend to be helpful, at least to some extent, and they flip the frame from what you're not to what you are or could be, to bring yourself back rather than to keep yourself down. So, ways to help them see a better self. All of these, I think of the breaking blame as depersonalizing and the healing shame as repersonalizing. Repersonalizing. Give me Trisha back, right? How can I help you think about who Trisha is and how you want her to be? And let's turn the conversation to that for just a little while, right? And those conversations fall in these 3 areas, right? Hey, what's good about you? I mean, what do you feel good about? And that might sound silly, but there are times when people have convinced themselves that that is an empty bucket. And being able to start thinking and talking about that might fill it up at least a little bit, right? What are you trying your best to make happen here, right? What are you most proud of in terms of what you're doing or what your work is? You might not have gotten all the way you want to get or even close to it, but what are you proud of at least trying in the situation? What are standards for you that you might live up to, and or some accomplishment that you could point to? Okay. This is a conversation that people who are really steeped in shame sometimes have difficulty going toward, but it's a great homework activity or exercise. Think about this. If you'd like to talk about it next time we're on the phone or you get together, see what they bring back. Changing this focus to how they can support that desired self-image. Hey, what can you do to increase your ability to be this better self? And how motivated are you to do that? And what kind of supports do you have for that? And last but not least, what is it costing you to beat up on yourself so much, right? I mean, I wouldn't use that language exactly, but that's really, kind of what's going on here, right? What's it costing you to be spending energy and time and your own sense of self focusing on, how shameful you are vis-a-vis this other person or this situation, right? Where could you put all that time and energy towards something that was going to be supportive and building of you rather than keep you feeling like, as one of my dear friends, Michael West, often says when he uses this drawing, keeping you clutching the chalk, drawing the lines that keep you crouched and afraid. So, simple conversations about shame, right? Simple conversations about shame. One of the things that I want to thank you for in addition to your attention, is that I know that all of you work in situations where you try your very best every day to take any tool at your disposal and to make somebody else's life better. So, to the extent that these tools might be helpful to you and that conflict coaching as a process, as a tool might be of interest, I applaud you and I really thank you for your attention and for all of the work you do. And that's it, Mel, turning it back to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Tricia, for this wealth of information and, your commitment to a more peaceful world. We are truly grateful. So could you go to the slide that has the information on the symposium? So we are holding our 10th National Symposium on Dispute Resolution in IDEA this October, and our call for proposals is open until the end of January, so we hope to see you there. Next slide, please. And if you want to remind I want to remind everyone about the evaluation survey that Noella has put in the chat. Your feedback is so very important to us, so please click on the link in the chat box and fill out that brief survey evaluating today's webinar. We greatly appreciate it. And again, thank you, Tricia, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And we wish you all a very happy 2025. So goodbye.